So if you can turn, please, to Acts 28, which is the last chapter of Acts. We're going to be reading from verse 11 through to verse 22. This then is the word of God. After 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria, with the twin gods as a figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. And from there we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 Taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when he came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, "Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they had examined me, they wished to set me at liberty, because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I had no charge to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I am wearing this chain." And they said to him, "We have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are. For with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against." So may God bless his word to us this morning, so that we may learn from it. So, this is part 62 of our reading through the book of Acts, and we are well into the last chapter, chapter 28. And with Paul, we are making our way, finally, towards the great city of Rome. And Luke documents the final part of their journey here, which involves 3 short boat trips. I'm just going to go to my little map here so you can see the journey and where these places are. So you can see that we started off in Caesarea. They changed boats initially at Myra. They then managed to get to Crete, and they were at that place called Fair Havens, and thought they'd just come along a little bit to Phoenix, but that's when the storm hit, and it blew them away from Crete and right along going west. They went all the way to this little island called Malta, and it was there that they were shipwrecked. And they were there at Malta. They were saved. God had promised them that they would be delivered, that no one would lose their life. And that's exactly what happened. Everyone managed to make it to shore, whether they could swim or not. God saved them. They were welcomed by the Maltese people there, and they were looked after, and they stayed there for 3 months. And it was after those 3 months, when the weather had improved, that they began to get another ship to go towards Rome, to rejoin their journey to Rome. And so you can see here that from Malta, those 3 arrows going up represent 3 little boat trips that they took before walking the final leg to Rome. And so beginning from verse 11, this is the 3rd ship that they've actually used. First one, of course, got them to Myra. The second one got ruined and shipwrecked on Malta. So this is the 3rd boat that they've used. And this one, unlike their previous ship, they'd made it to Malta before that stormy season, before that wind came up. And so they safely waited out the winter there at Malta. Now, after 3 months, as we said, the season had come to resume sailing, with the weather being more favorable. And this ship is an Alexandrian grain ship, similar to the one that got wrecked. But this one has a figurehead, we're told, carved into its bow of what's called the twin gods. I thought I'd just explain to you what this is. Because you see, this is about the superstitious nature of sailors Because as we've seen, sailors have to brave the seas and the wind, and so there's danger always. And there's always been something mysterious about the sea. I think of monsters that are there or strange creatures, that there's always temptations and dangers because it's so mysterious. They don't know what's over the horizon. So the sea has always been a bit mysterious. And so sailors ever always have been keen to have any fortune on their side. And so the theory here was that by having the twin sons of Zeus, who were called Castor and Pollux, we probably know them also from the star sign Gemini. But they thought that by putting this figurehead on the top of the front of the boat, that would help to bring them luck, because it was thought that Castor and Pollux were supposed to protect people on the sea, the seafarers and the sailors. But of course, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because these passengers on this ship have just witnessed the very real saving power of the God whom Paul worships. And they've already heard how Paul had a visitation from an angel who promised them that they would be saved, and they were. So they've actually seen and had an example of the real God who really protects sailors and who controls the stormy seas and the stormy winds. And I wonder if when they got on this boat, and here's these two little, wooden figures of the fabled sons of Zeus, hopefully going to protect them, that these guys that you guys don't really know who the real God is. These guys aren't going to protect you. Let me tell you about the real God who protects. I wonder if that was a bit of a conversation starter, pointing to these twin gods, so to speak, on the front of the boat. Nonetheless, they island hopped from the island of Malta to the bigger island there, the island of Sicily. You've probably heard of Sicily. It's a famous big island off the coast of Italy, and you can tell Italy always looks like a boot, like a big boot. You can see that, the big boot coming down there. Looks like Sicily looks like it's being kicked by the boot of Italy. So they managed to get to Sicily, putting in at the famous port of Syracuse, where there was temples and a theatre there. They stayed there for 3 days. Then they finally reached the mainland at Rhegium, which is located right on the toe of the boot of Italy. Then they had another quick sail with the benefit of the southerly wind, we're told, which took them to the port of Puteoli, which otherwise, if they hadn't have taken that journey by boat, it would have been a 257-mile march by road, so much better to go by boat. But it's at Puteoli that they get off the boat, and the rest of the trip is going to be on foot to Rome. And Luke tells us that when they got to Puteoli in verse 14, that Christianity was there because there were some believers. They met some believers in Puteoli. So that tells us that Christianity wasn't just in Rome, but that it had spread deeper into Italy as a whole. Now, Puteoli was some 130 miles south of Rome proper. And there had been people from Rome in Jerusalem at the time of Pentecost, when the church was founded, which was actually some 35 years previously. That was in Acts 2:10. You might remember when we read about when the Holy Spirit came. And at that time, there were some people from Rome. It says that in Acts 2:10. And so perhaps those people got saved, went back to Rome, and maybe established the church there. Of course, Paul, he wrote a letter to the church in Rome. He wrote it about 2 or 3 years before this time. And, of course, we still have that letter today, which is called, who knows what Paul's letter is called? Does anybody know what Paul's letter is called that he wrote to Rome? It's in the Bible. Sorry, what was that? Romans, yes. See, you're going to be Bible scholars, I can tell. Yes. And maybe this is how these Christians in Puteoli knew about Paul, because they probably heard the letter being read out to them from Paul, encouraging them, telling them about what the gospel is and how to behave as Christians. And so they probably knew Paul, and suddenly they hear that this same guy has just come on a prison ship, and he's here in Puteoli. I think we should take note in verse 14 In verse 14 there, it talks about the hospitable nature of these Christians who had put Paul and his companions up for a whole week while the bigger travelling party, because you remember you've got Roman soldiers and other prisoners preparing to push on towards Rome by foot. And here are these Christians offering hospitality for a week to Paul and his companions. And that is always a distinguishing mark of Christians. It's always been. We Christians, we are generous, we're kind, and we're hospitable. And Jesus said that would be a mark, that people would see the love that we have for one another. We're different, you see. So that's an important thing that I always encourage everybody. If you ever have the opportunity to be kind or generous or hospitable, do it, because that's in keeping with God, with Christ, and with what he wants us to be like, what Christians are like. Well, these Christians at Puteoli not only gave Paul and his companions hospitality, but I think some of them ran back to Rome and told the Christian church there that Paul, that guy who wrote that letter, he's here and he's coming to Rome. Because what we read about is that some people from the Christian church in Rome, they sent a delegation. Some of them came down to meet Paul, firstly at a place called the Forum of Appius. The Forum of Appius, you can see that in verse 15. Now, Forum of Appius, in this case, just means the marketplace of Appius. And also, they also met him a bit further along at the Three Taverns. Now, two things. Firstly, I'll show you the map there, so you can see those dots up there as they make their way up from Puteoli to the Forum on the Appian Way, and then the Three Taverns as you're getting closer and closer to Rome. Now, it's called the Forum on the Appian Way, or the Appius, because of this road that you see here, which is called the Appian Way. This was the main Roman road running from the south of Italy all the way up to Rome, and it's still in existence today. Here it is. So you can actually walk on the very stones that Paul walked on his way to Rome. Originally, it was some 350 miles long. Some of it has been, of course, built over, but close to Rome in particular, it's still in this amazing, pristine condition. You can see there the quality of the work of the famous Roman roads. And when we were in Italy, Angela, we were actually close to it, and I didn't realize. And I could have gone to see it myself, and I didn't. So I missed out. So that'll be something that I'll have to do in the future. But I think it's interesting to note in verse 15, just going back to the scriptures there, Paul seems to have been really affected when he met these Christian brothers and sisters, because it says there in verse 15 that Paul thanked God and took courage. And I don't think it was just a quick, oh, thank God. Gosh, I feel so encouraged now. It wasn't just a quick thing like that. It was more. It was more than that. Because after all, you got to remember that Paul had longed to visit Rome for so long. He wanted to come and impart to the Roman church, because he had written those 3 years ago when he wrote that book of that letter of Romans. Let me quote to you a little bit about it. This is in Romans 1, 9-15. He says, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow, by God's will, I may now at least succeed in coming to you, Roman church, for I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you, that is, that we might be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, my brothers in Rome, that I've often intended to come to you, but thus far I've been prevented, in order that I might reap a harvest among you as amongst the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish, so I am eager to preach the gospel to you who also are in Rome." So that was 3 years ago. He was saying, I so want to come. I long to come. So Paul was obviously personally invested to go to Rome. And the end of Romans, the letter, Romans 16, 1-15, lists several people who Paul knew who were in Rome. And it's interesting because one of them, or a couple of them, is actually Priscilla and Aquila, who you might remember we met in Acts 18, who worked really closely with Paul in Ephesus. And maybe Priscilla and Aquila might have been two of the people that had come down from Rome to meet him and welcome him. But apart from this relational aspect, of course, remember, Paul had been commanded by Christ himself. In Acts 23:11, do you remember? Paul's in the prison in Jerusalem, and the Lord appears and stands by him and says, "You must testify in Rome, just like you testified about me in Jerusalem." So he had a commandment. He was on a mission from God, if you like it says in the Blues Brothers. They were on a mission from God. Yet it seems that circumstances seem to conspire against him. Now, if you've been told something that God wants you to do, you'd think that God would make it easy. You'd think that God would just make everything just straightforward. Everything's prepared. You just have to walk forwards, and that because you're doing God's work, right? So everything's just going to be easy. But that's not what happened. Circumstances seem to conspire against Paul. Think about what happened. He had to battle all the way. I was just making a list of the things that happened to him, right? So originally he had planned to make his way to Rome straight after visiting Jerusalem. You remember, he went to Jerusalem to give a gift, a financial gift to help the needy church. And once he'd done that, he was going to go to Rome. That was his plan. You can read about that in Romans 15, from 25-29. But what happened instead? Instead, he was unjustly arrested, and he was accused in Jerusalem. He was mobbed. He was subjected to endless trials. He was the target of 2 assassinations by the Jews, and he was falsely imprisoned then for 2 years in Caesarea. Then he nearly drowned. Of course, he got shipwrecked, and he got nearly killed by the Roman guards. You might remember the guards had a Roman guards. It was their life that was forfeit if their prisoners escaped. And so they had the idea, well, let's kill the prisoners now because they might escape in the middle of the shipwreck. But the centurion, Julius, said, no, let's not do that. I want to make sure Paul survives. We're not going to do that. Not going to kill the prisoners. We're going to let them have a chance to get to shore. So he was almost killed by Roman guards. And if that wasn't enough, he finally gets to shore, and what happens? Oh yeah, he's even bitten by a poisonous snake. So it wasn't easy. But finally, here he was at this place here, welcomed by the Christians of Rome coming to him. He's here. He's been longing for this. He's finally made it, safely, warmly welcomed, even given an escort into the city, permitted to stay in his own residence while the other prisoners are delivered to the prison. No wonder he was thankful to God. No wonder he took courage after everything. God had fulfilled his promise, despite all of the challenges. We are meant to be impressed, folks, when we read this, by God's faithfulness and providence, both of which are so overwhelmingly evident here, despite the obvious resistance pitted against Paul and the cause of the gospel. And we mustn't be naive here. The devil is at work. There are plenty of examples in scriptures where God wanted to do something and the devil rose up and tried to do harm. When Jesus was born, the king went to kill all of the children under 2, and he found out that they were in Bethlehem. So there's a challenge here, always a challenge, to prevent the cause of the gospel. And here it is. Here's God's apostle. It's no mistake that all of this challenge and this resistance came against him. Stories like this, and even you might remember the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, another example of someone who had to walk through a really long journey of ups and downs, even though he had the promise of God, but he was thrown in prison, he was denied justice, He did everything right, and yet he was falsely accused, thrown in jail a couple of times. But in the end, he rose to the position of the Prime Minister of Egypt, and he gave salvation not only to the Jews, but also to the Egyptians and the other nations around. It reminds us all to be patient and long-suffering in the midst of hardship. And we all go through hardship, right? Yet we are confident that in the end, God will be vindicated and you will be delivered. I think this story here of Paul just sort of stopping for a moment and giving thanks, I think it reminds us that it's good to stop and reflect how we got from where we were to where we are now. And I'm always amazed, guys, and I even did this recently with Angela. We were in our room, and I just turned to her and I was just thinking about all the things that have happened in the last year. And I'm amazed how often it is that I've just taken God for granted. When I actually sit down and think of all the things that happened, with cancer scare and being able to go through the hospital and being here, was I ever going to preach again? Because you can hear it's affected my voice a little bit, but I'm doing it. I'm still okay. And we're getting blessed by it. And God is just so good. And yet I just took it for granted. I didn't realize how much he's done for me and how much things have progressed for the good. It helps to remind you of God's provision and kindness and to give thanks with a grateful heart, because I know I don't deserve any of it. It's just because God is kind. It's because of his grace. And, I was also thinking that when they finally got to Rome and Paul was given his own little place to have under guard, so he was under house arrest, but all the other prisoners were delivered safely to the jail there in the Rome. But I wonder that the centurion Julius, who you might remember was in charge of getting all the prisoners safely, well, what a journey he'd had. He probably thanked God that he was able to deliver all of the prisoners safely to Rome. I think he would have been pretty relieved to actually have made it, to hand them over after such a harrowing journey that he had to go, and he had to make some very key decisions, didn't he, to be able to get everybody safely there. But I wonder that he probably went for a well-deserved holiday afterwards, or maybe retired. Maybe he thought, that's enough. I don't want to go through that again. But I do think that there's a good chance that he became a Christian because he was really impressed with Paul. He listened to what Paul said, and he believed the word of the Lord, and he was a good man. So I wouldn't be surprised if we meet this guy, Julius, the centurion, in heaven. Now have a look at verse 16. It says there that we learn about Paul's house arrest, which is fairly lenient. He's allowed to have visitors and receive provisions and support, but he's also under constant guard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, it doesn't tell you here, but I can tell you that then the guards were typically chained to the prisoner. So there would have been a guard chained to Paul, probably on his wrist. He would have been chained. And in Peter's case, you might remember he had 2 guards. He was chained to him, but here was probably just 1 guard that was chained. Now, the guard was changed every 4 to 6 hours. So what that means is that Paul would have had at least 4 different soldiers chained to him that he could evangelize every day. So these guards, you just imagine that you sort of change to the Apostle Paul, right? Who's just this amazing witness and example of good Christian living and truth and integrity. And here you are. Oh, hi, Paul. What do you want to talk about? Well, says Paul, let me tell you some things about Jesus. So it begs the question, who was captured to whom, really? Whilst he was under guard at this time in Rome, while he was there at this time, and he ended up being 2 years in Rome, Paul wrote his letters or epistles. He wrote these letters, which we have today in our Bible. So he wrote the Ephesians, he wrote the letter to the Philippians, to the Colossians, and to Philemon, who, by the way, Philemon, if you've ever read it, is a story about a slave who is actually owned by Philemon, who's a Christian, and that the slave's name is, I think it's Onesius. And it actually says in Philemon that Onesius became a Christian while Paul was in chains. So this guy, Nicias, became a Christian while Paul was in Rome. So here's Paul reaping a harvest, even though he's chained up in Rome. So these letters are often called the prison letters because they were written while he was in prison. And Paul, we can tell it's in the prison because Paul occasionally says of himself that he's a prisoner of Christ Jesus, or he says he's an ambassador in chains while he's there in Rome. And I want to particularly concentrate on the book of Philippians, because there are two other references in Philippians which tell you how effective Paul was amongst the Roman guards. So please turn with me to Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 14. So Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 14. So let me read this to you. So this is Paul writing to the Christians in Philippi, to the Philippians there. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me, and he's talking about him being in prison as a prisoner in Rome, what's happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having confidence in the Lord because of my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So Paul's opportunity to witness to his guards whilst chained to him resulted in at least some of them being converted, and yet others probably being sympathetic and perhaps supportive of Christianity. And note that these guards were just ordinary soldiers. Paul here says that they are members of the imperial guard, so they're connected to the service of the Caesar, the emperor himself. And this is borne out actually at the end of the letter to the Philippians, because in Philippians 4:22, at the end, Paul writes, all the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. So there are saints in Caesar's household. Now, Caesar's household here probably refers to anyone connected with the imperial emperor's personal servants. So that includes the soldiers, slaves, or freedmen doing some service for him. So it's most likely that some of these had become Christians rather than members of the emperor, who was the Emperor Nero at this time, rather than the Emperor Nero's family. But all of this would have been really encouraging in Philippi, because Philippi was a Roman colony. So to hear that there was some in the inner circle of the emperor himself who had become believers would have been really encouraging. So here's Paul, the chained prisoner, infiltrating even the emperor's circle. Just amazing. However, we need to point out, of course, that it's not just the Gentiles. Even though Paul is in the mightiest metropolis of the Gentiles in the ancient world, it is not only to the Gentiles that he's reaching out. In fact, Paul's first reaching out to people in Rome is to the leaders of the Jewish synagogues in Rome. And you can see that in verse 17. Because he's constrained to house arrest, right? So he couldn't go to the synagogue. So what do? He invites the leadership to come to him. It was the only way that he could reach out to the Jewish population. So why does he do this? There's a couple of reasons, I think. Firstly, I think Paul wanted them to get the right understanding of why he was there. He wanted to preempt, if you like, rumors that might prejudice the Jews about who he was and what he was about, and also what Christianity was about, and what the church that was already established in Rome was about. It can be easy for us to think that Paul would hold some ill feeling toward the Jews after his experience with them, but that would be to misrepresent it entirely. Because you've got to remember, he identifies himself as a Jew. And he actually argues again and again in the trials that we've seen, and even right here, that Christianity is consistent with true Judaism, because it is in accordance with both the law and the prophets, especially regarding the hope in the resurrection of the dead through the Messiah. Paul had been accused of being anti-Jewish before and teaching against Moses and the temple and being against Israel itself. But these accusations were false, and they'd been failed to be proven by his accusers several times, we have seen already. Because Paul actually loves Israel and the Israelites. And in this passage, you see, he calls them his brothers in verse 17. Read that. He calls them his brothers, and he refers to our people. He includes himself. He talks about the custom of our fathers. And significantly, when he refers to Israel as being his nation in verse 19, Paul's point is to tell the Jewish leaders of Rome that although the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem had incorrectly accused him in court, he himself had not accused them in court of anything. He was not against the Jews or Israel. Indeed, even the Romans were ready and willing to release him, having found nothing to the charges, he says in verse 18. But Paul reached out to the Roman Jewish leaders for another reason. And in Romans 1:16, it says that the gospel is first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. Why does it say that? Well, this not only reflects the reality of history, that, the salvation, the message of the Bible, it all began amongst the Jews. It was given to the Jews because the truth is that God had chosen Israel to be his people. He'd invested in them the scriptures and the prophets, and ultimately even the Messiah, Jesus himself. He was a Jew. And in every city he went, you might remember, when Paul went to a new city, what did he do? Well, in Damascus, in Acts 9, he went to the synagogue first. When he went to Pisidian Antioch in Acts 13, he went to the synagogue first. Or in Corinth in Acts 18, he went to the synagogue first. That was his modus operandi. That was his usual practice. It made sense in one way because they knew the scriptures. So when he was talking about Jesus being the Messiah, fulfilling the scriptures, it helps if you know the scriptures. So that makes sense. But it's also because this is the pattern that was established by God. And it mentions it in Isaiah 49:5-6, where the Messiah is to be a light to the nations. But he's sent also to restore the tribes of Jacob. So gathering the synagogue leaders in Rome is actually consistent not only with Paul's usual practice, but also with the pattern established by God throughout the scriptures. And when the Jewish leaders respond to Paul in verse 21 and 22, it turns out that they haven't heard anything about Paul. So either the religious leaders who had accused Paul in Jerusalem and knew that the case was going to go to Rome, either they knew that the case was poor and they hadn't made any effort to set ahead the documents for this case, or maybe they were still on the way, perhaps facing similar challenges that Paul had faced in getting to Rome. So maybe they just hadn't made it yet. But for whatever reason, they didn't know anything about Paul. But these leaders of the Jews in Rome had heard about Christianity and had heard that it had caused controversy everywhere. However, I want to point out to you how fortunately and wisely these people wanted to hear the story from Paul himself, rather than to base their opinion and judgment just on hearsay, just what they had heard. They had the opportunity here to hear from the horse's mouth, if you like. So they gave Paul the unique opportunity, which was no doubt God-given, to set the record straight and deliver a proper presentation to them about how Jesus was the hope of Israel. They'd been longed for so many centuries and predicted by the scriptures. So Paul's coming to Rome was strategic for the Jews as well as for the Gentiles. So to bring this to a quick conclusion now, the significance of the Roman Church and of Rome, always such a big thing for Paul, something that God himself, Jesus himself, had told him he must go and testify. It was never an end in itself, however, but rather the idea is for it to become a launching pad for the gospel, to penetrate into the rest of the Roman Empire, as well as the Jews in Rome and beyond. You see, Paul himself, once he was released, intended to, and all indications are, that he did go to Spain. after this. In Romans 15:24-28, Paul talks about his plan to go to Spain after Rome. Paul no doubt hoped that the Roman church would grow and mature, and that some Jews would join the church as well and understand the full message of the gospel that he had written to them in the letters to the Romans, so that they could all join him and get involved with the missionary zeal. Because as all roads led to Rome, all roads led out of Rome into the regions where Paul wanted to go. Because Paul wrote of his ambition to preach the gospel where Christ had not yet been told, and where people had yet to hear the name Jesus and to understand the gospel. So in many ways, getting to Rome was not the end of the journey, but actually the beginning. And the fact that we Gentiles here, we're Gentiles from all different nations, you know. I'm from Australia, Angela's from South Africa, we've got people from Pakistan, people from the Netherlands, from Belgium. And also we've got the boys who've got their roots in Ghana. Yep. In our small little group, look at us all, Gentiles from all the different nations. We're here today worshipping God together. It's testimony that the gospel did indeed go out into all the world. And you know, this was all happening around AD 60, 61, 62. And AD 70 was fast approaching. Time was running out for the Jews because of unparalleled national calamity in the form of the destruction of the Jewish temple in AD 70 after a widespread Jewish rebellion. It was just around the corner. In 10 years or so, the Jews will be facing a crisis of faith and devastation. So here's God reaching out to the Jews as well as to the Gentiles to give them all hope. Jesus was the hope of all Israel and of all Gentiles, and he remains so to this very day. And with the tragic and misguided war going on in the Middle East right now, people getting killed, countries being destroyed, involving nations claiming to represent Muslim and Christian and Jewish ideals, it is all the more apparent that the truth of Jesus and his kingdom still needs to be proclaimed and taught in a troubled world, because there is simply no other way. Jesus is the only hope. Let's pray.